An Ontario school board is attempting to scrub the record from its parent-led meeting minutes after one parent objected to the use of land acknowledgements.
Alberta and Ottawa have struck a verbal deal. Ottawa will scrap the emissions cap and strike down other laws which could prevent pipelines from getting to tidewater.
A national security analyst is urging Ottawa not to wait for the U.S. to designate Muslim Brotherhood-aligned organizations and warns that Canada is, quote, not prepared for the threat their ideology poses. Hello, Canada. It's Friday, November 28th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Melanie Bennet.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. The Waterloo Region District School Board attempted to remove a parent's objection to land acknowledgements from its official Parent Involvement Committee meeting minutes. This is the second time that an Ontario school board interfered in parent-led governance to suppress disagreement with land acknowledgements from appearing on public records. In September, parent member Cristina Beiros Fernandez raised a procedural objection to opening Parent Involvement Committee meetings with a land acknowledgement. Fernandez has previously been successful at removing land acknowledgements from Parent Council meetings. The Parent Involvement Committee's then chair agreed to, quote, note the objection, but Director Scott Miller immediately intervenes, stating that, quote, as far as objections being noted in the minutes, we won't be recording that. He said, quote, I think we've been pretty clear as a district school board what we believe our commitment to truth and reconciliation, call to action, and that's across the province. Miller was referring to the Ministry of Education's recent intervention at the Dufferin-Peel Catholic District School Board, compelling the board to raise the, quote, survivor's flag for truth and reconciliation even after the board adopted a, quote, government flags only policy. At the November meeting, the committee ultimately voted to record the objections, but to exclude mention of the director's interference. So, Melanie, you've spoken to the parents and you've looked into this issue. How did parents react with regard to this interaction and how the board, the committee, handled this situation?
Well, Cosmin, I was able to attend the Waterloo Board Parent Involvement Committee meeting this week. And from what I observed, most parents in the meeting didn't jump in at all when this happened. The parents who are at the center of this story, they were pretty clear in expressing their concerns that the committee would just so easily and deliberately exclude really important detail from the public record. So in this case, the detail is that the board here is overstepping in their authority to oppose ideological or political statements. So both Cristina Beiros Fernandez and Jeff Horseman pushed back on the director's interference straight away. And also pushed back on the committee's refusal to include that detail in the minutes. Now, there are obvious issues with the Director of Education interfering in parent-led governance, but that's not really the central issue. The central issue is why a Parent Involvement Committee would agree to erase facts, events that actually happened. Why would they want to remove that from the official record? So ultimately, board staff, and that includes the Director of Education, really have no business interfering in parent governance. So PIC or Parent Involvement Committee, they're supposed to be parent-run committees, and that those committees give feedback to the school boards themselves. So when leadership steps in to dictate what can or can't be recorded, that really undermines the whole process of parents having governance at all. And this really isn't the first time that a school board has interfered in this way over parental objections to land acknowledgements. So in Hamilton, if you remember Catherine Kronos, she objected to a land acknowledgement at her school council, and that went viral online. In the video, you can hear her asking that her objection be recorded in the meeting minutes. And not long after that viral video, the school board intervened and suspended her from attending further meetings. And it really wasn't until the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom stepped in that she was reinstated. I think things like this send a strong message that parents are being punished for disagreeing with political speech in a government setting. And now in Waterloo, this has escalated even further. And as of today, the JCCF has stepped in again, and this time with a legal challenge. Jeff Horseman, the parent I just mentioned, he filed a judicial review arguing that mandatory land acknowledgements and basically banning all debate about them exceeds the board's authority and violates his particular charter rights to freedom of conscience. I spoke to Jeff today and he told me that he did try to go through all the proper channels, but that he only turned to the courts or to the legal system when it became clear that parents were not allowed to ask, they're not even allowed to ask any questions about the policy at all. So the reaction from parents, I think, well, at least Christina and Jeff, is quite firm. They're willing to defend their rights to express their views on political statements like land acknowledgements, even if the school board does try to sweep that under the carpet. It seems to me they're quite frustrated. They feel sidelined, that they're increasingly turning to legal avenues because the avenues designed to give them a voice are completely shutting them out. Alberta and the federal government have signed a sweeping energy agreement that includes building a new Indigenous co-owned bitumen pipeline to Asian markets, the suspension of the federal clean electricity regulation, and the commitment from Ottawa not to implement the oil and gas emissions cap. Alberta and Ottawa have signed a memorandum of understanding to collaborate on major energy infrastructure, carbon reduction projects, and regulatory reforms. The deal was signed on Thursday. The Memorandum of Understanding states that Alberta, Ottawa, Indigenous peoples, and the industry must, quote, work together cooperatively to foster the conditions necessary for infrastructure, including pipelines, that will unlock and grow natural resource production and transportation in Western Canada. The provincial government called the agreement, quote, a critical step towards achieving Alberta and Canada's shared goal of turning our country into a world energy superpower. Central to the deal is a new privately financed pipeline to transfer more than 1 million barrels per day of low-emission Alberta bitumen to a deep water port with access to Asian markets. The Memorandum of Understanding specifies that the project will be ready for submission to the Major Projects Office by July 1st, 2026. This pipeline will be in addition to expanding Trans Mountain for an extra 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day to Asia. The federal government agreed to adjust the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act to facilitate construction if the pipeline is approved under the Building Canada Act. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith called the agreement a new starting point for nation building.
This is Alberta's moment of opportunity. Our opportunity to show the nation, as well as the entire world, that resource development and emissions reduction can not only coexist, but can actually complement one another for the benefit of billions of people around the world. Alberta is willing to take on and conquer the challenge as partners with the federal government.
So, Cosmin, can you tell me if there have been any further developments since this story was published? Like, for example, how have other key players responded?
Yeah, there actually have been quite a few notable developments since the original story dropped, and the key one is Stephen Guilbeault's reported resignation from cabinet. Now, that happened immediately after the Alberta-Ottawa energy agreement was announced, and according to a senior government source who spoke to CTV, the timing was no coincidence. It was linked, and I guess Guilbeault resigned in reaction to that. Now, as we're recording this, Guilbeault has actually not spoken publicly on this, but that might have changed in the next little while. But essentially, the government source said that the MOU and Guilbeault's exit were connected. And that makes sense considering Guilbeault's background as a longtime anti-pipeline activist. I mean, he was arrested for scaling the CN Tower, and it's no surprise that he couldn't stomach what seems to be an indication that Ottawa is willing to work with Alberta to some level, albeit I will add that there has been no crystallization of a pipeline plan. But this is at least a step in that direction and a political agreement to get something done, perhaps. So yeah, Guilbeault's resignation is the major one. He said he's going to stay on as an MP under the Liberals foreseeably for now. But politically, it is a big signal and a shift within Carney's cabinet because Guilbeault was one of the hardcore Trudeau loyalists and one of the holdovers from Trudeau's own cabinet. He was the environment minister under the former prime minister, and Carney had shifted him into his role for as the culture minister, and he actually held that position before under Trudeau as well. But beyond Ottawa, there have been quite a few other reactions, especially from British Columbia Premier David Eby, and he's doubled down on opposition to a pipeline, which will have to go through British Columbia and exit on British Columbia's northwest coast. He alleged that there were no proponents to the project, and even Trans Mountain Pipeline wasn't at capacity, which he said gives further reason not to build a pipeline. And the other thing was that a coastal First Nations group in BC that represents all the Indigenous tribes and groups that live along the BC coast do not support a bitumen pipeline to the northern coast. And Eby said without that support, there is basically no deal and it's dead on arrival. So quite a day, quite a reaction. But, I think things are developing rapidly, and who knows where this is going to go ultimately or whether a new pipeline will be built. Canada is dangerously unprepared for the growing threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood, according to a national security analyst. The expert is demanding Ottawa launch its own probe into groups tied to the Islamist ideology, warning that the danger to Western society is being ignored as the U.S. moves to label some Muslim Brotherhood entities as terrorist organizations. Joe Adam George, a national security analyst with the Macdonald Laurier Institute and research lead on Islamist threats at the Middle East Forum, told True North that Canada must ban organizations linked to the Muslim Brotherhood and ensure those groups' members cannot rebrand. George said Canada should start its own process of listing Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups as terrorist entities. U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled the start of a, quote, comprehensive U.S. campaign against the Global Brotherhood Network through an executive order, but Canada's laws differ from those of the U.S. George said, quote, you can't have a blanket ban on an organization like the Muslim Brotherhood. Recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood is far more of an ideology than an organization. It's a disparate group of entities. You're not a card-carrying member of the Muslim Brotherhood. You merely need to be aligned with its ideology. George said Muslim Brotherhood ideology believes in conducting, quote, covert or stealth jihad with the goal of fulfilling Allah's wish to make the world Islamic. He said, quote, these are people who are extremely, strongly ideologically bound to this statute and they hold it dear because this isn't an ideology about guns and bombs. The people we're talking about, a lot of them are white-collar people. They could be your school teachers, lawyers, nonprofit professionals working in the nonprofit sector, and so on, people of influence. He said the Muslim Brotherhood engages in, quote, institutional capture. Its groups are not involved in, quote, carrying bombs and guns, but in creating a, quote, permissive environment and running propaganda campaigns which ultimately radicalize young individuals to act on Islamist rhetoric. Melanie, you're familiar with Joe Adam George and his work. You've spoken to him before. What are some recommendations for the Canadian government that he's made to tackle the ideological threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood and affiliated organizations?
Yeah, Cosmin, I have spoken with Joe Adam George, and his message to Canada is pretty consistent the times that I have spoken to him. He thinks that Canada's problem really is one of enforcement. So this is not a question of ignorance. Canada knows what's going on, and he recommends moving away from monitoring the situation into actual criminal consequences where evidence supports action of that kind. If individuals here in Canada are tied into extremist terrorist networks abroad, he wants Ottawa to be willing to charge them under existing terrorism and anti-terror financing laws that we have in place already. The second big piece here is definitely the charities. If a charity or a nonprofit is found to be part of a Muslim Brotherhood ecosystem, and we know some are, he says that Canada should not only pull their status permanently, but ban the key figures, the individuals, from running charities under a different name. So my understanding is for George that the rebranding game that we're seeing here is part of a bigger long-term strategy. And like he says, Canada has a white-collar Islamist problem. So he really means that many of the people behind the Brotherhood are often doctors and lawyers, like he says. They're not the violent street thugs that people might imagine. And I spoke to Joe recently about his meeting in Washington, where he came away with a really strong sense that the world was waking up to the Muslim Brotherhood. And we're certainly seeing that in America right now. But Canada's starting to look like a weak link. A senior figure in the Trump administration told him that they see Canada's as they see that Canada has an Islamist extremism problem, and that's become, as he called it, a semi-domestic issue, right? So that's because the problem here spills across the border, and whether that's terrorism financing or money laundering or ideological networks, it sort of ends up in the same soup here. So the solution, I think, is simple, even if it is politically difficult, that Canada should use the tools that we already have, things like investigating seriously or enforcing consistently and shutting down front groups to stop pretending that Canada can sit this one out while our allies deal with the threat.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.